Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Elder Justice Initiative webinar, Justice and Compassion, Empowering Faith Communities in the Prevention and Intervention of Elder Abuse. As with all technology, we may at some point experience a momentary lapse in the webinar session, and in the event of a problem, please just be patient, remain with us, and the webinar should resume shortly. We do want to take a moment here to see that everyone is connected. If you are experiencing any technical issues, please send a private chat message to our technical specialist, Danielle, in the chat pod on the lower right. Or if you cannot access the chat, you may also send Danielle an email at dmclain@ovcttac.org. Throughout the webinar, if you have questions, we invite you to use the chat pod to ask questions of our presenters, or again, if you have any technical issues you're experiencing along the way. I do want to let you know that today's session is being recorded and will be made available on the OVC-TTAC training website and the Elder Justice website. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Elder Justice Initiative. The mission of the EJI is to support and coordinate the Department of Justice enforcement and programmatic efforts to combat elder abuse, neglect, and financial fraud and scams that target older adults. The initiative does this by helping to promote justice for older adults, helping older victims and their families, enhancing state and local efforts through trainings and resources such as this, and supporting research to improve elder abuse policy and practice. So along with those training and resources that we mentioned, the Elder Justice website is found here at www.justice.gov/elderjustice. Again, all of the trainings and resources that you hear about today can be found on this website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speakers for today's webinar. Dr. Anne Marie Hunter, Director of Safe Haven's Interfaith Partnership Against Domestic Violence and Elder Abuse, is our first speaker. She is an ordained United Methodist pastor who's received her Master's of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School in 1986 and a PhD in Religion and Society from Drew University in 1991. While attending Harvard and Drew, Anne Marie worked for two domestic violence agencies, Harbor Me in East Boston, Massachusetts, and Jersey Battered Women's Services in Morristown, New Jersey. Anne Marie also served for 6 years as the pastor of East Saugus United Methodist Church in Massachusetts. And in 1991, she linked her pastoral, seminary, and domestic violence services experience and partnered with a group of faith-based women to found Safe Haven's Interfaith Partnership Against Domestic Violence and Elder Abuse, a religiously pluralistic grassroots nonprofit that provides faith-based training, resources, and technical assistance on domestic and sexual violence and elder abuse. Dr. Hunter has taught at Drew University, Tufts University, and has lectured at Andover Newton Theological School and Boston University School of Theology, Weston School of Theology, and Boston University School of Public Health. She's also presented about faith and about numerous times at the American Academy of Religion and has published several articles about elder abuse and faith. We're so happy to have her with us today. Our second speaker is Tovah Kasdin. She's the director of ElderSAFE Center at Charles E. Smith Life Communities, the first shelter of its kind for abused and neglected older adults in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Tovah's 20 years of experience in the domestic violence field includes a former domestic violence prosecutor for the Montgomery County, Maryland State's Attorney Office, nonprofit manager and consultant providing guidance to international organizations, including the World Bank Group, on best practices for domestic violence prevention and response. She was a past president and currently on the board of directors of the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence and the Legal Resource Center on Violence Against Women. Tovah has testified on the state and national level on domestic violence and elder abuse topics and is a frequent trainer and conference speaker. And last but not least, Rabbi James Michael is the Director of Pastoral Care at the Charles E. Smith Life Communities in Rockville, Maryland, where he's served since 2003. Born in Auburn, New York, he received a Bachelor of Arts from Cornell University in 1968 and was ordained and received his Master of Arts in Hebrew Letters from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York in 1974. Immediately after ordination, he pursued graduate education in Jewish history at Yeshiva University in New York and then entered the pulpit. Rabbi Michaels has served in pulpits in Whitestone, New York, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and Flint, Michigan. Throughout those years, he's worked as a healthcare chaplain at Bronx Psychiatric Center and with the Veterans Administration. He became a board-certified chaplain in 2005 and was certified as a CPE supervisor in 2007. He received his Doctor of Ministry in Pastoral Counseling from the Graduate Theological Foundation in 2006 with a specialization in bereavement counseling, and he has co-edited Flourishing in the Later Years, Jewish Perspectives in Long-Term Pastoral Care, an anthology of 23 new articles. We're so happy to have each of you with us, and at that point, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Hunter to begin. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anne Marie Hunter, and I'm honored to be here with my colleagues, Tovah, Kasdin, and Rabbi James Michaels from the ElderSAFE Center in Maryland. I'm going to dive in first and tell you a bit about faith and abuse in later life, and then Tovah and Rabbi Michaels will fill you in about their work at ElderSAFE and the work we've done together in Maryland. But first, we want to learn just a little bit about who you are. We're really interested in who our allied professionals are with us today. I'm so glad to have you all on the line. So our first poll question here, we'll just ask you to identify kind of where you place yourself in this sort of spectrum of folks who could be working on abuse of older adults. And if you just fill yourself in there, we'll be able to tell who's on the line today. It looks like we've got a really broad spectrum of participants. Wow. Excellent. I'm very happy to see my clergy and faith community leader colleagues on the line. Thank you. This is great. And the victim service advocates as well. Wow. Excellent. So our second question is, we're just a little curious, for those of you who are not faith leaders, we were just wondering, have you had any experience working with faith communities or faith leaders on issues of elder abuse? And just wondering how many of you have kind of put a toe in the water here. Looks like it's about 50-50. Well, a little bit more haven't than have now, as more answers pour in. Okay, so it's close, but it looks like more of you have not worked with faith community leaders or faith communities on this issue than have, which is great. That's why we're here to talk about this. So thank you so much for that. It gives me a little bit of a glimpse of who you all are and what's happening. So I wanted to start by just saying that I'm a faith leader who came at this from the field of domestic violence. So elder abuse has been a real learning curve for me. In about 2007, I heard Bonnie Brandel of the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life speak about elder abuse, and a huge light bulb went off over my head. And I was suddenly thinking that some of the situations that I had encountered when I was pastoring in a small local church began to make a lot more sense in light of this lens, which I wish I had had at the time. So in 2008, I began to partner with Bonnie on resources for faith leaders and advocates about elder abuse, and you can find those resources on our website at interfaithpartners.org or the INCAL website at incall.us. Anyway, then in 2014, Bonnie, along with her colleagues, Risa Breckman and M.T. Conley, surveyed about, 750 stakeholders in the field and asked the question, to understand, prevent, identify, or respond to elder abuse, neglect, or exploitation, we need, and people filled in the question and basically built the way forward collectively, and that was all published in this document, the Elder Justice Roadmap. And it's an important document for a number of reasons. It kind of gives us a way forward, but one of the things that the roadmap came up with was how important it is to include faith communities, but also that the elder abuse is an emerging health, justice, financial, and social crisis. So just looking at the demographics, elder abuse is pressing and critical because by 2030, 50 million people, or about 19% of the U.S. population, will be 65 plus. So that's important to know. But also, in addition to the demographics, elder abuse is also, in my mind, a crisis because it's mostly unspoken and unreported. And so people are going unhealed from my point of view. So whether because they don't trust helping agencies, or they don't know where to turn for help, or because they don't want to turn in a family member or friend, or they belong to the stiff upper lip can-do generation, or they are, for some reason, physically, emotionally, or mentally cannot report, or they don't have the resources to cut ties with an abuser, elder abuse is vastly underreported. And that means that the suffering is continuing even as we speak, and that's what makes this really a crisis issue in my mind. And it's really a life and death issue as well. We know that elder abuse, as you see here from the Locke study, triples the risk of premature death. So it's really important that we take this on. The Elder Justice Roadmap stated that this crisis requires the engagement of diverse disciplines and fields, professions in many settings. And we've worked hard at Safe Havens to engage faith communities and faith leaders in solutions to this problem. So if you're asking yourself, what does faith have to do with elder abuse, you're in good company, because people ask me that question all the time. So I want to try to build a case for why building these partnerships between local faith leaders and adult protective services and faith communities and advocates, and et cetera, all the allied professionals you saw in our poll, why that's so important. So first of all, I'll just make a case that faith community affiliation is significant for older adults. It's an important thing to know about older adults. You see here that older adults are even more likely than the average American to be faith affiliated. And in low-income, rural, ethnic, and racial minority communities, faith communities are vibrant and engaging, and faith leaders are typically trusted and respected. So this is an important aspect of the life of many older adults. Older adults are not just faith affiliated, but they are also often deeply engaged in the lives of their congregations. And here the American Psychological Association states that half of older adults report being active in their faith communities weekly. One revelation from the Georgia Commission on Family Violence's annual domestic violence fatality review was the number of abuse victims who are active in faith communities and reach out to those faith communities for support. So we know that faith communities are already being called upon to respond to abuse. And it turns out that older adults, who are even more likely to be faith affiliated than the general population, strongly indicate that they would turn to a faith leader for help if they were faced with abuse. And this was particularly true of older adults who are members of minority communities. So again, keeping in mind those underserved communities. It's one thing to say that you would turn to a faith leader when faced with abuse. It's another thing to be able to name that faith leader or that congregation. In a Canadian study, and this is from 2003, 52% of respondents over 76 could identify a specific congregation when asked where they would reach out for help if they were faced with abuse. And this is a generation for whom faith-based values regarding family and relationship are particularly important, as shown here in this Beau-Laurier study. So faith communities are important to older adults as a place to turn for help when faced with abuse, but I believe that there's even more going on here. I'll speak in a moment about ways in which faith can be a barrier to safety, and I certainly don't want to downplay that. But first I want to suggest that in some ways faith can undermine the effects of abuse or mitigate the effects of abuse. For example, we know that isolation is an important element of elder abuse, and isolation can be compounded by aging, and it's a risk factor. And I just want to point out that the root of the word religion is to connect, religare, to connect. Religion can connect us to all sorts of things. It's the same root as the word ligament. Can counteract isolation by connecting us to our community, our traditions, families and cultures, our history, our country of origin, etc. Important to know that faith is a connector. There was a recent Florida case where a woman was living in her own home independently and was basically taken captive by her adult grandson and his partner and locked in the tool shed in the backyard, and her grandson made her home into a meth lab. And that would have continued unchecked, except that this woman had been going to the same faith community for many years. And one of her friends there said she would never have missed Bible study Wednesday night without calling me. And so that friend called for a well visit, and they discovered her alive, and she has survived, and the grandson is incarcerated. So those sorts of, just like a real-life example of how important those connections can be. We also know that abuse can be crazy-making. Abusers deliberately confuse and confound their victims. And those who abuse older adults can use the normal fears of dementia and the normal loss of memory against their victims as a weapon to make this confusion even more fearful and dizzying. And in the midst of all this, faith can help faithful people orient themselves and sort of keep their bearings as they go through this crazy-making situation. So whether you're someone who prays 5 times a day facing Mecca, or you worship in a sanctuary facing east, or you mark time in a series of liturgical seasons or holidays and high holidays, or rhythms of fasting and feasting, or whether you observe daily and weekly rituals, faith can help people remain grounded and centered in the midst of the crazy-making. Abuse also takes many things away. Survivors lose jobs and homes, contact with loved ones and family, the respect of the community, and their own self-esteem, and so much more. Faith is one way that survivors can remember who they are. They can remember their relationship to the divine and reassure themselves of their own worth and consequence. It's also a resource they can carry with them for strength and courage. And it can also help victims mourn the inevitable losses that accompany abuse and help victims heal. So, of course, not all older adults who experience abuse are faith-based, but we all have an innate sense of justice, and when we feel violated or oppressed, we all need someone to bear witness and to help us process our experiences. Often, healing, justice, and hope have a spiritual component, even when the person seeking them does not identify as faithful or observant in any way. So meeting the needs of whole people, whether that person is your client or your congregant, may mean that we need partnerships among elder abuse experts, domestic and sexual violence providers, adult protective services, faith leaders, and many other allied professionals in the community. Sometimes faith leaders may be the first people in the community to identify elder abuse. We are perfectly socially located to recognize and respond to older adults who are experiencing abuse because we see older adults in their own context over time, as Podniak says so eloquently here. We are often in those spaces with older adults. So we know older adults across generations often. We have known them for a long time sometimes. We visit in hospitals and nursing homes and homes. So we've seen a side of an older adult that others may not have even been exposed to. We provide worship opportunities in nursing homes and assisted living facilities. And I will tell you that in one nursing home, an older adult told me that the chaplains coming in and the faith leaders from the community coming in were particularly important because when he wanted to express a concern or a complaint about the nursing home, he feared to do that through his own family because then it would be clear who had complained. But he said that he could tell his faith leaders, and since the faith leaders saw many people in the nursing home, it wouldn't be so obvious who was complaining. So that role within nursing homes and rehab hospitals and hospitals can be important in a way that I hadn't even thought of it before I talked to this older adult. So we also visit shut-in members of our communities and congregations in their homes. We provide worship and spiritual practices, opportunities. We are present in so many ways. We've had so many opportunities to see older adults. And it just makes me think that if I had known what to look for when I was pastoring in my small church in Massachusetts, I might have been able to identify abuse earlier than when it usually comes to light, which is, sometimes a police officer is investigating or something by that point. So if we're partnered with an agency such as ElderSAFE, where we being faith leaders, could receive training on what to look out for in the community, imagine the suffering that we could avoid. So I promised to say a few words about faith when it is not a great resource, and that is when faith can be a barrier to safety for an older adult instead of a doorway to safety. So I'll just say that this is pretty much what older or elder abuse, abuse of older adults looked like in many congregations, but I'll own this and say this is what we looked like in my congregation. It simply wasn't something that we discussed or talked about. And the silence, I know, looking back on it, is deafening. So many older victims believe that they're the only ones facing abuse because they've never heard anyone else talk about it. So they think it's just them. And other older victims believe that God is on the side of the abuser and that they're supposed to put up with it or keep the family together no matter what, or other religious values can come into play here, and older adults feel that it's their duty to stay in a situation that's abusive. So if faith leaders receive training about elder abuse and break the silence in their communities and know the red flags to look out for and where to refer to services, this can make a huge difference in the lives of older adults. Now, on behalf of faith leaders everywhere, I have to say that most of us have received no training, no resources, no technical assistance about elder abuse of any kind. And at the same time, when congregants talk to their faith leaders about abuse, they not only minimize, which many advocates are used to and have been trained to recognize, but also I think when people talk to their faith leaders or people in their faith community, they sanitize. So you simply don't use the kind of ugly language that describes abuse when you're speaking to your faith leader in sacred space. So all that ugly, harsh language is drained away. And where an advocate might hear, he said, I'm half dead anyway, so he may as well fucking kill me, that's what the advocate may hear. What I'm going to hear as the faith leader is, he's not very nice. And so you can see where from the get-go we're on two different pages and not quite hearing the same thing. And I think it makes it easier for faith leaders to minimize and deny and to fall into quick fixes or dangerous fixes like couples counseling or something like that. So I will admit fully that we have not always been helpful. I led a faith community on the North Shore, as you just heard, of Boston for 6 years, and I really wish I had received training about elder abuse and been welcomed into a partnership with an agency like ElderSAFE. I can only imagine the difference that it could have made in the life of my congregants. I think especially about Mary, whose adult grandson broke into her apartment and demanded money. And when she refused, he pushed her to the ground and broke her arm and a rib. It turned out it wasn't the first time this grandson had threatened her, and she needed my help to be safe, or she needed help to be safe. She needed a referral. I visited Mary in the hospital. We had the usual hospital prayer, etc. I tried to be present, but I was not hearing what had actually happened. And I think, too, about Teresa. When I arrived in my congregation, Teresa's husband was in a coma in a hospital, and so I really never got to know him, although I visited him in the hospital. After he passed away, I went to Teresa's house, ready with the usual condolences on my lips as she opened the door, and thinking that we were going to work together to put the funeral arrangements in order. And she met me at the door, and before I could say a word, she said, "Thank God that bastard's dead." And she then told me about 60 years of unbelievable physical and emotional and verbal and spiritual abuse that she had never told anyone about. So she was living with layers of trauma, and she really needed help to process those years of abuse and to find herself again. And I think also about Wilson, who was slowly dying at home and being cared for by his adult son. Wilson really needed someone to investigate why his care was so inadequate and neglectful. And then there was Agnes, whose spending habits changed a lot after her adult nephew moved in to take care of her. And I'm wishing now that I had asked more questions about that as well. So these are older adults in our communities. This is a small congregation. You can imagine if I had been in a much larger congregation what a difference this could make, but how many older adults there are that could be helped with faith leaders knowing a little bit more about abuse. So given that older adults are so faith affiliated and have themselves named the spiritual suffering that results from abuse, and you see that here. This is a quote from an elder abuse survivor who came to one of our focus groups in 2009. It makes sense that faith leaders learn more about elder abuse, and then we act proactively to build partnerships in our communities that can help keep older adults safer. So the ElderSAFE community is doing just that, and I'd like to turn this presentation over now to Tovah Kasdin and Rabbi James Michaels, and let them tell you about the work that they're doing and the work we've done together, because I truly believe that it is groundbreaking.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you so much for your wonderful partnership and expertise on this most important issue. What I'd first like to do before we delve into our partnership and the work we've done together on the Faith Leaders Elder Abuse Pilot Project is tell you a little bit about our ElderSAFE Center and the work that we do. We were established in 2014 as a comprehensive ElderSAFE abuse center where we care for older adults who have been abused and neglected in the community. We offer safe temporary shelter, community education, and advocacy specifically focused on older adults who are 60 years old and above. We're located on the long-term campus of Charles E. Smith Life Communities in Rockville, Maryland, and our shelter is co-located on that campus. We also offer a language-accessible helpline to ensure that we receive referrals from the community and are able to assist older adults and professionals who have questions about elder abuse. We serve all of Maryland, D.C., and Northern Virginia as well. As Anne-Marie has noted, it's important that faith communities and service providers form alliances together, and that we don't handle these situations, which are most complex, in vacuums. But the most productive and safest results happen when we work together, and we do that in many ways. In building our partnership together, understanding that faith leaders are in effect first responders, and the faith communities, as Anne-Marie have noted, are perfect places in which faith leaders, lay leaders, and other professionals can form those trusting relationships to help older adults in need. We built this partnership really understanding that we wanted to do several things. In October 2015, we held a very large community-wide event to ensure that clergy, faith leaders, multidisciplinary team professionals, service providers from our whole region understood why they needed to engage in this issue and how they could work together. It was an incredible event and was very well received, and the folks in attendance asked, how do we do more? So what we talked about, Safe Havens and ElderSAFE, is how can we start small, like a pilot project, and see if we can in fact build an interfaith response to elder abuse that is specifically tailored to the needs of each community. Rather than coming in and saying, here's the 5 things that every community has to do, how can we be responsive to each community and their special needs? So what we did is we established in 2017 our Safe Havens partnership and trained community leaders participating in this pilot project. They are faith communities from the Jewish religion, the Christian religion, Islam as well, and we're starting small to see how we can in fact grow this initiative. But already the response has been incredible. We are hosting another event November 15th, 2017, and we invite those who are in our Washington, D.C. region to join us as Anne-Marie and her colleagues from Safe Havens will present and do more community education on engaging the clergy, and will feature the progress of our pilot project to date. We know that faith leaders are sometimes the first ones who hear about family situations that may in fact not come to light in other venues. So providing that safe and confidential opportunity for disclosure is what we aim to do when we've created this pilot project. We want to make sure that the faith community leaders, their lay leaders, and other staff in faith communities understand that we don't expect them to be experts, but rather that they recognize and effectively respond to signs of elder abuse, and they know who in the community to call. Their job can be the spiritual care, but it also has to be done within the framework of best practice. And that's where that partnership between the faith communities and service providers is so vital, to make sure we're always keeping safety in mind and we're educating those who are serving older adults to know when they indeed might need help. Some of the partnerships that we have in fact encouraged, it's not just ElderSAFE and the faith communities, but we introduce our faith community partners to other necessary services like adult protective services, domestic violence shelters, aging service community members, so that we see that we all have a part in responding to elder abuse. Each elder abuse case that we work on has many different community partners. One of our latest shelter clients, we had no less than 10 community partners working together to assist in creating more permanent, safe housing for this individual after discharge from our program. But first and foremost, we have to prioritize safety, because without a safe response, we, in fact, are not creating the long-term change that we want. We want our faith community leaders to be available spiritually for the victims who have experienced this horrific violence. And some of you might be wondering, how, in fact, can you be helpful to the situation and not harmful in any way? The first, most important thing is that you know to refer, that we don't expect you to have the subject matter expertise, but as we introduce you to our vital community partners in adult protective services and other service providers, that you come to know, learn about their programs, trust them, and they do the same, so that when you have an individual who comes to you, you actually can say, I've met Bill from Adult Protective Services, he's wonderful, and he can help with the situation. So it's very important to build those relationships. We also talk about the importance of simple actions on behalf of the clergy that really make a difference in the life of a congregation and community, to know that this, in fact, is a safe refuge to disclose abuse. So, for example, a couple months ago in my congregation, one of our associate rabbis who's working with us on the Faith Leaders Elder Abuse Pilot Project did a small sermon on elder abuse and how hidden it is from the eye, and how important it is to be there for our older adults in the congregation. Not less than 24 hours later, I had a message on my email when she introduced ElderSAFE as a responsive resource, asking how, in fact, that could help someone's parents who were in distress and needed this assistance. The simple opportunity to open up the dialogue will open up an ocean that was already there, but in fact can now be mitigated in a much easier and responsible way. When I've talked about this issue publicly in my faith community, I've had child survivors of domestic violence come forward and talk about the experiences that they had, and now they know that there's a safe person to talk to refer them to help that they need. So by opening up the discussion, you're signaling not only that you care about this issue, but it's a safe place to disclose. We also want to invite experts as well as service providers to teach in the congregation. With our pilot project, we've done this in several ways. We have an ElderSAFE placemat that we've created that talks more conversationally about recognizing the signs of abuse. And we have featured this placemat and a live discussion about concerns older adults might have with abuse and neglect at their lunch programs. And it has been a very successful start to opening up a conversation that was not there originally. I've had older adults come up to me afterwards privately to disclose abuse that they've experienced in marriages, as well as concerns they have right now regarding people controlling their finances that they may not want them to do that. So it's important, again, to create these opportunities that every congregation has. You can put your resources, like your community partners, like ElderSAFE, in brochures or posters in the congregation, and this all helps to build a community response that is safe and effective. So as we talk about the importance of building the response with our community faith leaders, I wanted to invite Rabbi Michaels to share how we in fact have utilized this engagement of clergy on our own campus and how that has effectively helped bring the issue to light at Charles E. Smith Life Communities.
Thank you, Tovah. Good afternoon. Ever since ElderSAFE was in its conceptual stage, even before we rolled it out, I've been involved in the planning because it was understood immediately that spiritual care was going to be an important component of the overall picture of care that we bring to the victims of abuse that we bring into our facility here for at least temporary shelter while they get the rest of their lives straight. Let me give you one example of a case that came in very shortly after we established. Of interest, it was not coming from any of our usual referrals. A woman was being admitted into our rehab facility for rehabilitation. It was during the evaluation and the admissions process that our director of admissions realized that there was abuse involved. So she called Tovah, and Tovah met with the new resident and realized that, yes, indeed, this was an abuse situation. It was at that point that I was called. And I would parenthetically add that every admission into our program requires a spiritual visit. And so I or one of my interns will go and visit at least once to a person who is here on ElderSAFE, and usually many more. Close parentheses. I was talking with this woman. Her mother was in the room with her, and I mentioned to her that we have regular religious services. Her eyes lit up, and her mother said, "Oh, you've wanted to go to services for a long time." But that, and I'll leave out the blanks, sounding of a gun, wouldn't let you go. Got very excited. Could I come to services here? Yes, you may. So we worked out an arrangement where she could come to services and participate, and she did for the month or two that she was here. It really made a difference in her improvement and her recovery, and I'm sure it has made a difference subsequent to her discharge. The point is that spiritual care is very much a part of the work that we do in ElderSAFE, and it should be very much a part of all aspects of the care for elderly and those who are exposed to elder abuse. Tovah and Anne-Marie have mentioned about the community outreach that we have done. These have gone through my department, and we do so because we want people to realize that this is a team effort. We have a large team here at the Charles E. Smith Life Communities providing care, but we want the community to be part of that care as well. What's most important is that those people, those clergy leaders and faith leaders, will understand how to respond, and to understand that what they say could be either very, very helpful or counterproductive. It's a matter of learning, being educated, knowing the right thing to say, knowing the right thing to do to make sure that the cycle of abuse is not perpetuated, that the cycle of abuse is ended. Faith is a very important component, as we've already established this afternoon. We, as faith leaders and community leaders, can help make that so.
Thank you, Rabbi Michaels. Rabbi Michaels pointed out a really important example about how one's spiritual access can be a form of power and control in an abusive relationship, which was the case with the client that he mentioned. I also wanted to mention, looking back when I was a domestic violence prosecutor in Montgomery County years ago, how the role of faith leaders can also put up another barrier for victims. When I was a prosecutor, I would note routinely that faith leaders would come to court, but guess what? They weren't sitting with the victim. They were sitting with the defendant accused of beating his wife. And the faith leader would stand up routinely as a character witness. And I thought to myself then, and I've thought more deeply about it now, what signal does that send to our victims who have experienced horrific abuse, that the faith community where they worshiped, where they confided in faith leaders, where they gave their heart to this community, would then turn around and quite publicly demonstrate that they were not with them, that they were very much aligning with the abuser. We have to be very careful as faith leaders and first responders to the issue of abuse that we, in fact, shore up the trust and the support for victims of domestic and elder abuse, that we don't, in fact, work against them and more spiritually isolate them, because I'm pretty sure that victims who watch their clergy member come and testify on behalf of the person who beat them will not be so quickly to go back and return to that community and trust in that faith leader again. So I wanted to point that out, too, that while there is much good that can be done, and we want to impart that upon you as faith leaders, you also have to be vigilant, too, that the actions that you show to the person who's experienced abuse and also those who may not recognize why abuse is so important in our greater secular society are sending a signal that's pretty powerful if we don't support the victims in our communities. So with that, I'm not sure, Anne-Marie, if you would like to add anything else. If not, then we can turn it over to the question and answer time.
I guess what I would add, Tovah, is that one thing that I've said, I couldn't agree with you more. Let me start out by saying that. I've articulated it by saying that the default value for the faith community or for the divine, whatever that looks like, God or whatever, that the default value in the lives of victims is that that power is on the side of the abuser. So unless faith communities and faith community members and leaders stand up and make a different statement, the default value is that the divine supports abuse and the continuation of the abuse. It's remarkable to me, and I've challenged my faith leader colleagues on this and said, you know, I don't think this is what we meant to communicate, but this is what we are communicating in ways just like you've illustrated. And I think it's really important that we take this on and hold each other accountable for this.
Thank you. So with that, perhaps we'll turn it over. It looks like there's lots of participants in the call that have some questions for the panelists today.
Yes, a lot of chatter going on in the chat pod, and also some questions that have come up. So one question that Debbie Booth asked is, how do we get our faith-based community to be more receptive to hearing our message? And there has been some follow-up chat and kind of building on to that about raising awareness and having faith leaders be more open to the idea that it could be and maybe is happening in their area.
I'll take that one on, Tovah, and then maybe you'd like to respond as well.
Sure.
Okay. It's true that many faith leaders, I've heard this myself, and I saw this in the chat box a few frames up about even if faith leaders will admit that abuse is happening, that they believe that it doesn't happen in their own community or in their own congregation. And to me, that's an extension of the many ways that people in general distance themselves from victims of abuse. And I think we do that for a number of reasons. That's a whole nother webinar. But we've worked hard to come up with ways to kind of get around that. There are some good resources that may help. There's a good video available out of the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life. They have a video called, or a resource called In Their Own Words. And it comes with a CD or a DVD, I guess, that has victims telling their own stories. And some of the victims even mention their faith communities. And I think it's helpful to hear those stories from victims themselves and to appreciate how important faith is to them, but also to appreciate that this does happen to people who are people of faith. The other thing, and this comes straight from a rural faith leader, I encounter, we have, at Safe Havens, we've just done about 20 trainings in rural communities around the U.S. And in preparation for that, we talked to a lot of rural faith leaders about elder abuse, domestic violence, et cetera, and where they were on this. And one faith leader that we talked to was absolutely engaged. He could not have been more aware or better trained or anything. He was just a poster child. And so I said to him, how did that happen? And he said that he had gone to a training. It was a hospital-based training about abuse. And I said, how did they get you in the room? And he said, the poster said to faith leaders, this is pointed directly to faith leaders, what you do in the community is as important to the health of this community as what we do. So it was definitely welcoming them as colleagues, as professionals, and recognizing that faith leaders do bring a lot to the table, and encouraging their engagement as allied professionals. And I think for him that was important. So I'll just throw that out there as what his advice was really speak to the need. You know, we are doing great work in our community, but to do even better work, we need your help. That kind of approach to faith leaders, I think, can be important. And the last thing I'll say, because I don't want to, I'm sorry I'm going on, but so we have resources that I referred to you earlier, elder abuse and faith resources. As part of that, we put together an outreach guide, and what we did was take the barriers that we had encountered, we being Safe Havens, over the years, because we've been doing this for many years. We took all the barriers we could think of that we've encountered when we have approached faith communities and faith leaders and tried to talk to them about abuse. And so we named the barrier, and then on the other side of the page, we named some of the strategies that we have developed over the years to get around those barriers. So if you look at that outreach guide, you might find that helpful. For example, sometimes you go to a faith leader to talk about elder abuse, and they'll say, oh, no, we're talking about homelessness this year. And so it's helpful to say, well, many people who are homeless because of abuse. You can kind of think of strategic things to say next. And that guide may help some of you to think about some of the things you're hearing and some possible responses that might help. There will be faith communities that you just will not have access to. So go for the low-hanging fruit. Go where you already have connections. Work with your board of directors or your staff or whatever. Try to get introduced. Go to the area clergy consortiums. Oftentimes in a rural community especially, the clergy get together once a month. Try to speak to one of those clergy, get on their agenda, and then be introduced by the clergy person so that you have a certain degree of trust already from the get-go. And you have to just build really slow. This is a very, very time-consuming process. So I'll leave it there. Tovah, I know you have so much to add.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I think all those suggestions are excellent, and Anne-Marie's materials that she mentions are incredible, and they're very warm and welcoming to clergy members. I'd also like to add that when we designed this Faith Leaders Elder Abuse Pilot Project, we did this with the intention of fitting in comfortable ways to communities that we're not asking them to do more, but rather our pitch is this issue is already happening, and we're here to help make it easier on you so you know where to refer and you don't feel panicked or scrambling when someone comes to you with this issue and you don't have the resources. So we're pitching this as a much easier way to actually access resources that are so important to addressing this issue, and we're just providing whatever you would like, whether it's a staff training, whether it's training your volunteers to deliver meals or do sick visits to your older adults. They're already going out there anyway. Why not bring some brochures or placemats with you, and that way they'll know about ElderSAFE and they'll call us. So we're really trying to create ways in which we can be true partners with our faith communities.
Yeah, I would chime in on that. I know from sitting behind the desk and being a faith leader myself in a congregation how little time they have. So I often say to them, this training will save you time because you don't have to be the hotline, you don't have to be the shelter, you don't have to be ElderSAFE, you don't have to be the expert or become the expert. You can rely on your community to provide all that. And you can do what you're best at, which is the spiritual guidance and support, and then refer to community services.
Great, thank you both. So another somewhat related question here from Dexter: what can be done to get faith leaders more involved with the reporting abuse? Reporting abuse. So a clergy member is has noticed or suspects abuse. What's the appropriate action, and how do we encourage that more?
So I can start with that. I would say that this is a very complex issue, and it's important to know your mandatory reporting laws in the state in which you reside. So for example, in the state of Maryland, where ElderSAFE is located, clergy are not mandatory reporters, which means they are not mandated to report, but they could report anonymously. They're not mandated to, but they could still electively decide to report. I think sometimes where faith leaders experience a lot of discernment is, well, wait, this was told to me in confidence. I'm not sure if I should say anything. Should I report? Should I not report? I don't really see proof. I don't really see the bruise, but she said she was grabbed. I think it's important to know that your job is not to investigate the allegation, but rather to be that connection to important community resources. So what I would offer is to say for faith leaders that they understand what the resources are, that they can say to the victim who has approached them, I know a really great resource in the community. Would you like to call them? Adult Protective Services, they are the ones who can protect you, and I'd really like to be able to introduce you to them because that is their role in the community. So really kind of taking away some of the fear and making it a trusted resource. So I think Rabbi Michaels would also
like to add that a good part, I was a pulpit rabbi for 35 years before I came here, and I know that one of the big issues is that most pulpit clergy don't think that it goes on in their communities. It goes on elsewhere. And there was actually a poll, when I was in New York, there was a poll done in the Jewish community where there was a report about abuse, so all the Orthodox rabbis said it must be happening in the Reform community, and the Reform rabbi said it must be happening in the Orthodox community. And of course the answer is it's happening everywhere. So it's a matter of making clergy aware that it is happening everywhere. No one is immune, and that we must become sensitive to it when it comes up to us. We can't simply say it's not happening here, because it is.
Great. Thank you for those responses. Very helpful. If a clergy member is meeting with a member of a congregation who discloses abuse, what rules of confidentiality apply?
So that is related to the question we just discussed regarding mandatory reporting. So again, it's important if you're a faith leader to understand what your duty to report is in the state that you reside. Having said that, I think confidentiality, if you're kind of using that as a shield to not address the paramount issue, which is the safety of the person in front of you, I think we're missing the whole point as to why that person has come to you to begin with. They're coming for help. And it's important, though, to not just take matters into your own hands. So the other side of the coin is you wouldn't want to say, oh, okay, I better just call the police to come to her house immediately and not tell her you're going to do that. Please show up, and she could be in greater danger if you did not use your community resource service providers to develop a comprehensive safety plan. So that's why it's incredibly important that we not put our congregants in greater harm's way by taking action that is not done in best practice, but rather in conjunction with experts who know how to do this in the community. So I think the most effective response is to say, it sounds like you're concerned about your safety in your home. Would you like to call Adult Protective Services together with me now? I have the number because they did a great training at my congregation last week, and here are some resources. We can call from the safety of my office if that's something you'd like to do today. And then you're engaging, which we should always be doing, in self-determination and centering on what the wishes of the client is. But at the same time, this is a layered, complicated question, and paramount is what are the mandatory reporting laws in the state that you reside.
And
Great,
I would chime in, and Rabbi Michaels, I hope you'll help me out here, but I would suggest that many faith leaders don't really know the mandatory reporting laws in their state, and that can also be part of a training, or even how to talk about confidentiality and mandatory reporting. Really, everyone in the congregation should know from the get-go if I am, what I'm mandated to report and how I would do that. And then I would also just throw in that I think safety is the #1 issue, as always, and it's very important to me that we look to have a safety plan and some other safety measures in place if we are going to be doing reporting, that we make sure that folks are safe, and that is best done in partnership with my community services.
I think one other way of approaching it, too, is to recognize that a person who calls a helpline is shielded from any kind of prosecution or any kind of legal jeopardy. So that if a clergy person calls, he or she shouldn't have to worry that somebody else is going to turn around and sue them.
If you make the call in good faith, as Rabbi Michael said, again, you're not here to prove it, but you're here to make the call in good faith, then it will be received in that way.
Right. And I've actually heard a lot of interest in this topic from faith leaders. So in answer to an earlier question about how to engage faith leaders, maybe this is the way to engage them, is a little training on mandated reporting.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for your responses to those. I know there's other questions that we were not able to get to. There is a lot of interest in this topic, and we are hoping that we address a lot of them through the webinars and the trainings and the materials that AJI is putting out. And so with that said, if you do have questions we didn't get to and you would like some follow-up, there's an email address shown on the screen, elder.justice@usdoj.gov. You can email us your questions, and we'll be happy to try to triage those and get those to the correct people for a response. I want to thank our presenters today for joining us for a wonderful presentation and so much great information. And again, thank you all for joining us and for your dedication to the field out there working, and we appreciate all that you do. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you again.